Assalamu alaikum, welcome to Game Changer. I'm Maryam Zia. Tonight we'll be talking about the most important climate conference that is happening right now in Baku, Azerbaijan. We know that Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, along with prominent leaders from around the world, have gathered in Azerbaijan to discuss the future of the planet Earth when we talk about, of course, climate change and damage adaptation and mitigation strategies. This year's conference has already been branded as Finance COP with a central focus for delivering the climate funding, especially to the vulnerable countries like Pakistan. We know that Pakistan is one of the countries that is suffering from the climate changes, and of course in today's program we will be talking about what COP has done so far, especially for the developing countries, and what lies ahead. Of course, when we look at different statements, UN climate chief has warned that climate finance is no act of charity. It is a global necessity. So in today's program, we'll be talking about different dimensions and significance of this conference that is going to be taking place from November 11 till November 22nd, and of course what lies ahead for Pakistan and other countries. Will this conference be a game changer for developing countries like Pakistan? To discuss this and more, we are joined in the studios by Mr. Munir Ahmed, who is Executive Director, DevCom, Pakistan Climate Advocacy Expert. Welcome to the program. We're also joined by Dr. Muhammad Irfan Khan, who is Dean, International Islamic University, Islamabad. Welcome to the program. We are joined online by Dr. Saleem Ali, who is Chair, Department of Geography and Distinguished Professor at University of Delaware, USA. Welcome to the program. We are joined online by Dr. Imran Saqib Khalid, who is Climate Governance Specialist. Welcome to the program. Mr. Munir, let me start with you. Of course, when we talk about this important conference that is, of course, happening right now in Baku, how different this is when we talk about, of course, the key takeaway from COP28 was about, of course, fossil fuels reduction. And this year's conference is being branded as, of course, Finance COP. What are your of course, your aspirations, or what are you looking forward to when we talk about the key discussions that are going to be taking place? Because we know that finance is an issue that most of the nations have very varying and different opinions about.
Certainly, it's a very important conference as the global leaders are discussing mechanisms for financing the climate-induced disasters and mitigation and adaptation measures. But this important COP is missed by 13 world leaders who are contributor of 70% of the total carbon emissions.
Rather,
and that is very
80%,
strange. That is very strange. The major countries, United States, China, Brazil, India, France, and several other leading countries are absent from this COP. But and their absence would certainly means a lot to the failure of this conference, because in the absence of these 13 leaders, we will not be able to succeed to meaningful dialogue and outcome on climate finance. But
right, let me of course take the same question to Dr. Saleem Ali. Dr. Saleem, what's your take on this? Of course, Munir Saab has alluded to that, of course, absence of key leadership of different countries in this conference, but we know that this has happened in past as well. How hopeful are you when we look at the dialogues and discussions that are going to be happening at this key and significant climate conference?
At COP28, the attendance is almost half. So obviously there is less kind of human dynamism and activity at this summit than there was in Dubai. This is often the case with these meetings of international treaties that you have after 3 or 4 years, a major conference that's going to discuss some very pressing issues that will be more consequential. And then you have a few years where there are more tangential issues that are discussed. So here it seems to be the case, and that this is one of those conferences which will not have as much of a splash. However, there are a few areas where there could be considerable progress. You have the $120 billion fund that is to be discussed by the 10 multilateral development banks and major donors to help countries like Pakistan, and that is being put forward. There is some level of cynicism around the fact that the conference is being hosted yet again by a major fossil fuel producing country. That was the case in Dubai as well. So some of the environmentalists have been concerned about that. But that decision on the venue was made partly because Russia had declined to attend if it had been in one of the Western countries. So Azerbaijan was a good compromise in terms of where it could be held. So I'm not raising many expectations from this meeting. There are some other unusual factors which will be interesting. It's being hosted again by a Muslim country, as was the case in Dubai. Pakistan, as the world's second largest Muslim country, has an important role to play in terms of, I think, galvanizing the Muslim community around this issue. And there have been efforts made to link faith communities to climate change mitigation. So that's something which may come out of this.
Right, of course, that remains an important aspect of it. But of course, we know that this conference is being branded as a finance COP. When we talk about this aspect, Mr. Irfan, how do you see that the UN report shows that a 259 billion gap in adaptation finance, especially for the developing nations? What are the most urgent areas where you see funding is needed?
As you said, that there is a gap of 250 billion. In that case, you see a lot of promises that have been made in the previous COPs, COP after COP, every year is coming on here. There were pledges, and that could never be fulfilled to that level. Particularly the developing countries like Pakistan, most of them are more vulnerable, and in that case they don't have the capacity, financial capacity, the technical capacity to go for the adaptive measures. So whenever they need certain kind of adaptive measures, they definitely require support from the developed world. So that's the problem. We found every year, you see, the first COP that was happened in Berlin, Germany, almost 30 years ago. So still we are facing the same, and our objective remained the same, that 1.5 degree back to the pre-industrial era. And it means for the last 30 years we are chasing those objectives that could not be achieved so far. So in that case, I think it's the biggest challenge. The adaptive capacity of the developing nations that need a lot of support, and that is missing.
Right, and of course adaptation remains an important aspect of it. But Dr. Imran, Saqib, when we look at the demands of these developing countries, those which are being impacted by the developed countries, of course there is need of over 1 trillion annual climate finance. How do you think realistically this is possible?
Yeah, thank you for having me be a part of the discussion. So let's contextualize the finances that have been made available up till now. So in 2009, a decision was made that before 2025, between the period of 2020 and 2025, the Western world, the developed world, would make available $100 billion on an annual basis, primarily in the shape of grants and concessional loans to address the climate crisis. That had not been forthcoming. I mean, it's just hasn't materialized the way we thought it would. So yes, the needs are in trillions of dollars. In fact, Pakistan, in its comments, has requested that the number be raised from $100 billion to $2 trillion collectively. That's not going to happen. There are wars happening. There are needs in the developed world in terms of adaptation as well as mitigation. And with the Trump government back in power in the United States, I do not think that the developed countries will be so forthcoming in terms of giving the necessary funding to the developing countries. Actually, this is a right. So there is this notion of common but differentiated responsibilities, and it was decided that because the greater amount of emissions over the past 100 years have come from the developed world, it was their responsibility to address this. But unfortunately, as has been discussed over the past 30 years, we have not been able to address mitigation. And right now, we haven't been able to address adaptation. And forget about loss and damage that Pakistan was very, very helpful in bringing forward the discussions over the past couple of years. There is no funding available for loss and damage either.
Right, and of course, Dr. Saleem, when we look at COP29, like other, of course, previous conferences, we see that there were some issues, but at the same time, how do you see the significance of new rules for the carbon markets that have been approved during the first day of discussion at the conference, especially under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement?
Yes, so with carbon markets, now we have reached a point where you have over $900 billion which are being traded globally on carbon cap and trade kind of mechanisms, basically, where the goal is that if you have polluters who are not able to reduce their emissions, they buy credits from others who are able to. And sometimes those credits involve sequestering carbon. Basically having projects which are going to plant trees that may remove the carbon from the atmosphere. And then increasingly, there is more push towards also having technological means of carbon abatement through carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture utilization, or what they call direct air capture, where you're just taking carbon dioxide directly out of the atmosphere and converting it into a form where it can't escape. So all that is being worked through these rules. I think the key thing that we have to keep an eye on is there has been a lot of fraud in the carbon market, because there are people who will come in and say, we have a forest, there could be some landowners, and they say, we have a forest and we are not going to develop it, and hence we should be given carbon credits, even if they are not going to develop it anyhow. So they're getting money for stuff that...
Dr. Saleem, don't you think that was an issue in the past? But now with the latest technologies and with satellites, of course, it is easier to keep track of the funding that is coming in, of course. And do you think...
No, I don't think so, because you see, the satellites are just telling you whether you have a green cover or not. But it's the intention of what is going to be done. So if you already have property which was not going to be developed and there's a forest, people are getting paid to keep it as a forest. And that was already providing a service of carbon abatement. So why should it be double counted? That's the problem. And the satellites can't help you with that, because satellite's going to show you still it's already a forest. So there is a problem. You have to actually go on the ground and figure out, is this actually a situation where new trees are being planted, or there is some activity that is going to be a different quality of botanicals, which will sequester more carbon, because not all trees work the same. So it has to be done at that level.
Right. And do you think that, of course, these technicalities could eventually or potentially undermine carbon market or carbon trade system, or do you think this is going to be strengthened in the long term? when we talk about the global efforts for, of course, climate efforts, if countries fail to reach emission reductions?
I think if there's good domestic regulation of carbon markets, then it could work. You have countries, we can't have international green police, right? It has to be done by the countries. They have to regulate it wherever these different credits are being issued. So if you are able to convince those countries to have good regulations for domestic enforcement of these markets, then it may well work out quite feasibly. So that's where I think a lot of the effort is going into.
Right, and Mr. Munir, what's your take on this important Article 6 that was under discussion on the first day of this summit, and is there any indication that Article 6 agreement will lead to a meaningful increase in climate finance, especially for the developing countries like Pakistan?
I really don't see, because 1.2 trillion annually what we are looking for. And when the countries are not contributing $100 billion to the climate fund, and how the developed countries would contribute $1.2 trillion to annually. So it's a big question. And while the major contributors are missing this conference, I really don't see any commitment from them to contribute, but still I believe that at least many of the countries who are part of the COP, they could have a bilateral agreements, and of course, like they can also develop regional clusters or regional voices at platforms to raise voice to the developed world. At least it will begin some new negotiations and new forums, but I really don't see, like if I see if I review all 28 COPs that has held and the outcome of it, and while America has already said that they will again pull out themselves from the Paris Agreement after Trump won the elections. So such kind of situation is really a very, it's not quite hopeful.
Right. But at the same time, when we look at the situation, Dr. Irfan, UN says we are heading towards 3.1, of course, centigrade warming by the century's end. What impact would this level of warming would have on the countries, especially like countries like Pakistan?
You see, this is the point the Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif raised today's speech, that this is the year of the glacial protection and preservation. And if that level of temperature increase, it's ultimately the first impact of the melting of the glaciers, and that eventually result into havoc in terms of floods. And flood protection demands certain kind of storages and storage capacity to be built, and that storage capacity need lot of financing, and that kind of water reservoir that can be built to protect from the floods, that again whatever you call it, a reservoir or a dam or flood protection measures, that will definitely. But here you see the debates moving around between the climate finance and the carbon finance. Two are entirely different things. Carbon finance, they are talking about more trading on these areas. Yeah. Climate finance, you finance from developed countries to developing countries to build their adaptive capacity, to take mitigation measures, to support them. Like you asked this question about the raising
building the infrastructure, is giving, of course.
So if as a result of this raising in the temperature will eventually result into the flooding, and we need some flood protection measures, flood protection infrastructure. There we need support.
Right. And let me move to Dr. Imran. Dr. Imran, as COP29 is going to be progressing, How do you see the dialogues coming about, especially when we look at the global temperatures and this year 2024 being declared as one of the warmest years so far? Are we seeing stronger commitments from countries on cutting emissions to meet 1.5 Celsius goal?
No. So very briefly, no, we're not seeing any of that. In fact, we'll be crossing, the data shows that we'll be crossing 1.5 degrees centigrade for the first time this year. And I'm very apprehensive. I think we'll cross the 1.5 mark for good by the end of this decade. And even 2 degrees is a no-go. And I'll tell you why. It's because the countries who rely on all fossil fuels are they're continuing to build new facilities. So the United States, countries in the European Union, Russia, and now China and India as well. There is this focus on oil and gas, and we are seeing that. We in fact, there is a video out now. Whereby the leadership of the COP conference from Azerbaijan, they were shown to be making deals about oil and gas business deals right before the conference. So this is something we saw last year as well, and I think that's business as usual. Nothing's going to happen vis-a-vis mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage. Funding is not going to materialize. At the end of the day, the vulnerable countries are going to be left on their own. And here, what we can do is to focus on our own governance issues. There are ways that we can address the crises that countries like Pakistan are facing. So when it comes to floods, when it comes to heat waves, when it comes to the impact of climate change on agriculture, there are many things that we can do without financial help that can set us on a path towards resilience. Because if we stop and think about finances from abroad, that's not going to materialize.
Right. And what kind of structures or mechanisms are we looking towards? And also we know that, of course, Pakistan suffered over $30 billion when we look at, of course, climate losses. How do you see Pakistan's participation in this summit? Are we looking for that climate finance?
Yeah, we are looking for that climate finance, and I think it is our right. So let me say that it is our right. This is what the global north owes us because of their historic emissions. But let's not, allow us to believe that somehow those finances are going to be made available. Unfortunately, they won't. We'll have to struggle for this. So the WWF has been part of the Recharge Pakistan program along with the Ministry of Climate Change. There have been some other ones that have come through the Green Climate Fund. So we are trying and vying for these projects. We do have a national adaptation plan, but we do not have localized district level adaptation planning. That needs to happen. We need to have local governments in place that can address the challenges at the local level. A top-down approach, headquartered in Islamabad or the provincial capitals has not worked. If we start to focus on bringing communities together, having a dialogue on how to address this in a collective manner, perhaps we can address this on our own with little help from the outside, because that's what we are seeing. Large amount of funds, they're not going to materialize.
And Mr. Munir, when we look at the frequency of extreme weathers in Pakistan and of course the floods we earlier witnessed, how do you see what kind of policies and mechanisms should Pakistan be advocating in this significant summit, and especially when we look at Pakistan's approach to advocating for common but differentiated responsibility at COP29?
We don't have grassroots mechanisms to reach out to communities. First of all, we have to make certain mechanisms to reach out to community level, and we need to map out the vulnerable spots, and certainly accordingly we have to develop strategies to take measures before any other disaster hit the communities. And this is quite unfortunate that despite all awareness campaigns and despite all mechanisms, but we could not convince communities to take preemptive measures, and that is very important. Though National Disaster Management Authority and the provincial disaster management authorities, they have very vigorous and very proactive plans, but that do not reach out to communities, and we also not have district disaster management authorities. We have a national climate policy, and also that is developed in coordination with the provinces, but unfortunately,
level, of course, approach is needed.
there is no district level approach or union council level approach. So we need to have such kind of mechanisms in place, and we need to have more proactive policies and actions.
Right, of course, that is when we talk about developing countries like Pakistan. But Dr. Saleem, when we look at the overall scenario, of course, we know that wealthier nations are the ones that are contributing to more than 80% of these carbon emissions. How do you see that this injustice is going to be discussed? And what kind of outcomes are we looking at when we specifically look at COP29?
Well, there is a big difference between the various developed countries on this. The Europeans are much more sympathetic to the developing world, but there is a big divide across the Atlantic with reference to the United States and also even to some degree Canada. Because both the United States and Canada are now major fossil fuel producing countries. And so that has led to the current dynamic in terms of an impasse on what can be done by the developed countries. One of the big bones of contention that has been there is the classification of China as a developing country. So whenever this issue is brought up about differentiated responsibilities, the United States says that, look, China in many ways is much more developed than the US. They have faster trains. They have all this amazing development in their cities. Why should they be pretending to be a developing country? That is brought up. So that has been a major point of contention throughout this impasse on the climate change negotiations. And I don't see any way out of it, because the relationship, unfortunately, between the US and China has deteriorated even further in the last few years. In fact, when President Biden assumed office, one of the things he had said was that China and the US could cooperate on climate change. That was one area he said, we are competitors in other areas, but we can cooperate on climate change. But that didn't come to pass. He appointed a very senior US politician, former senator from Massachusetts, John Kerry, as the climate envoy, but there was no tangible progress made on any matters. In fact, what the US kept saying to China was, just fund more mitigation in developing countries.
Of course, these are some of the geopolitical controversies that are surrounding with, of course, this conference, as we have witnessed in the past as well. But coming back to developing countries like Pakistan, we know that the deadline for NDCs or nationally determined contributions is, of course, going to be coming on February 2025. So, Dr. Saleem, how do you see that developing countries like Pakistan can improve their NDCs, especially given their limited financial resources?
Yes, I mean, I think the energy sector is the primary area that Pakistan needs to focus on. And in terms of meeting our own NDC contribution targets, there needs to be a very concerted discussion around the role of hydropower. I think we cannot move just away from carbon fuels through solar and wind. We will need to focus on hydropower and to some degree nuclear. We have aging nuclear power plants, relatively speaking, but they could play a role if we can develop low-cost nuclear in the future with China's cooperation. That can be a major way in which we can reduce our reliance on fossil fuels. At COP28, there was a commitment made to triple nuclear energy production by 2050, which included countries across the board, from the US to UK to many of the Gulf countries as well. So I think we should think about those ways of meeting our
But this time
NDCs.
around, Dr. Saleem, we are not seeing any discussion around the outcomes regarding fossil fuels reduction. What is the reason behind that, and also what are, in your opinion, challenges when we look at, of course, the NDCs, especially in regards to Pakistan?
Well, we are not seeing much progress because there's a kind of pragmatic approach that is being taken regarding fossil fuels, especially natural gas. There's a realization that oil will eventually get phased out, but natural gas is going to play a much more dominant role. And of course, being hosted in a country which is a major fossil fuel producer makes a difference. The president of Azerbaijan just made a statement earlier today that fossil fuels are a gift of God. So, there's this presumption that we have this as a blessing and we should use them effectively. So I think we are at a real impasse in terms of how this transition is going to happen away from fossil fuel, especially with natural gas. So the other option then is, well, let's look for other kinds of sources for energy generation, and then let the market play its role. And if you're going to have cheaper energy produced through hydropower and other sources, hopefully that will just crowd out fossil fuels. That has happened to some degree with oil with reference to transport, electric cars, and uptake also in terms of move to gas in power plants has reduced oil usage. But we still have natural gas production and consumption growing.
Right, and Dr. Irfan, when we look at, of course, the controversies that are surrounding this conference, and of course, like Dr. Saleem alluded to, this has happened in the past as well. But looking at the previous climate pledges, how do you see that the countries are going to be moving forward, especially in terms of transparency and mechanism for keeping check and balance on those pledges? And are we going to be moving towards legal mechanisms in terms of just waiting for the countries to come forward voluntarily?
Yes, I think you're right. We are not just waiting, we are lagging behind in terms of developing the governance mechanisms and instrument development. And for example, taking the example of Pakistan, Climate Change Act that came in 2017, and an authority has not yet been functional in that way. And when we are having an what you call Climate Change Council, just once in a blue moon is meeting, and they have not yet developed any legal instrument to the local level, how to operationalize these kind of mechanisms, and we are talking about those things. So I think first we have to put our own house in order. If we want to materialize any support from the developed world coming to here, it has to be in a legalized way, in a transparent way, and a rational way to be disbursed and spent on the realistic, pragmatic approach. And that's really the missing part on part of our own as a nation.
Right, and Munir sir, what's your take on this? When we talk about, of course, the COP29, funding is main focus in this COP, and of course Article 6 being discussed, and a lot of controversies surrounding it, but Pakistan pushing for and of course becoming the voice of developing countries. How do you see the discussions moving forward in coming days?
We must appreciate Pakistan's leadership for conducting climate finance roundtable on climate finance, and this is a good beginning. And I believe like the impact of this roundtable would go to like in the coming days, and it would certainly influence the negotiations, and it has set tone for the coming days. On the other hand, I believe when we talk about loss and damage fund, that was purely made for the developing countries and the least developed world, those who suffer from different disasters. But 2 years after, we are still missing the governance of the loss and damage fund, and there is no representatives of the from the developing
And
countries on it.
that leads me to my next question, that
Yeah.
is about the mechanisms that, of course,
Yeah.
we need some kind of mechanism to, of course, keep a check and balance on those pledges that were made. What kind of course, mechanisms are available at this point in time, and are we going to be started working towards those mechanisms and keeping transparency on those kind of mechanisms? What are we looking at?
Basically, like if this COP could come up with certain mechanism to develop a loss and damage fund, and its monitoring of the fund, certainly it would be a breakthrough in it. But I don't know what were the reasons that the governance structure of the loss and damage fund was not completed, and that is irony. That what we agree in the COP, and we linger on the
And even most of the pledges were in the form of loans.
yeah.
And of course, that is what UN is saying, that this climate finance is not a charity
Of
for the
course.
developing countries, because they are suffering
Yeah.
from the doings of developed countries.
That's true. The UN Secretary General has rightly said it's not a charity. It's basically the developed world has to pay. But when we estimate, it's about $1.2 trillion annually. And who would be contributing it? When they are not complying their previously made commitments. But in the meanwhile, the countries like Pakistan has to take measures at home. For example, if we can reduce loss of nature, or like we can protect our own nature resources, perhaps that would help us. When we say that our carbon emissions is around 1%, on the other hand, our natural the loss of nature or green cover is huge. When we talk about the monsoon rains and floods, certainly a lot of water come, but we don't have any system to store that water. If we could have localized solutions.
Right, of course, infrastructure is required, and for that infrastructure, of course, finance is required. And Dr. Saleem, when we look at the financing and with the theme of this COP29 regarding the finance COP, how do you see that these vulnerable countries and the struggling economies are going to be moving forward and pushing for funding?
To be self-reliant. They have to stop constantly being beholden to the donors. We are living in a current situation where there are two major wars being fought in the world, and unfortunately, much of the attention of the bilateral donors, individual countries giving money, like the Americans or the Europeans, is going towards those wars. Imagine the amount of money that is being spent by the Europeans just to support Ukrainian refugees. You have several million people who have been displaced. Similarly, in the US also, in terms of their weapons contributions and so on, in both the wars, huge investment. So unfortunately, climate change is not going to be a priority issue. So what do the developing countries do? They need to be more self-reliant in finding indigenous solutions, both for mitigation and also finding ways in which they can generate what we call green growth. You find opportunities to attract businesses and other kinds of investments from whatever little money the government has in those businesses, which will both reduce pollution, increase adaptation, and also move forward in terms of economic growth. And it is possible. You have the Global Green Growth Institute in South Korea, which was set up after one of the COP meetings, actually, at COP15 in Copenhagen so many years ago, which is aimed at specifically doing that. So I think those are the kinds of things we need to focus on. We have to stop going around with a begging bowl.
Right. Right, and Dr. Imran, your last words. Of course, Pakistan remains 10th most vulnerable countries when it comes to climate change. How do you see this COP29 is going to be helping Pakistan in adaptation, mitigation strategies or mechanisms? And of course, when we talk about climate justice.
Yeah, so climate justice, when we talk about climate justice, let's not forget that while there's a global north and there's a global south, within our own country, there is a north and south. There is a divide between people living in Islamabad, F7, E7, posh areas versus people in Nasirabad and Balochistan who got affected by the recent floods. So there is this dichotomy between the haves and the have-nots in this country that needs to be recognized and needs to be addressed. When we go to these conferences, we need to learn from experiences of other countries, other communities, and gain from that. So recently, there's an example of just energy transition partnerships, whereby funding from the global north has gone to South Africa, Vietnam, Senegal. Now, all of these countries have gained billions of dollars for a just transition, but they had plans in place. We do not have a plan in place to move away from fossil fuels. Remember, over the past 5 or 6 years, we've put in a number of coal power plants. Now, how can we do that given the, degrading air quality in this country, the fact that we remain the vulnerable country? So this needs to be addressed.
Right. Unfortunately, we are completely out of time. Thank you very much, Dr. Imran Saqib Khalid, for joining us in today's program. Thank you very much, Dr. Saleem Ali, for joining us in today's program. Thank you very much, Mr. Munir Ahmed, for joining us in today's program. Thank you very much, Mr. Muhammad Irfan Khan, for joining us in today's program. Of course, we'll be taking a look at the incoming events and dialogues that are going to be taking place at COP29 that is happening at Baku, Azerbaijan. But that's all from Game Changer tonight. Take care. Allah Hafiz.